For over 41 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Center. And we start again with the situation in the eastern Ukrainian Donbass. There, the Russian army managed to achieve another milestone, so to speak, in the Donetsk region in their goal to take over the entire area. We have footage from the former 12,000 inhabitant town of Chasiv Yar. And these recordings show that by now the entire town is under Russian control. We see total destruction here in these, in some cases, relatively large buildings, so partly multi-story buildings, these apartment blocks, as one knows them from Eastern Europe, where Russian soldiers have now hung their flags all over the place, marking their presence. The Russians are also showing us on the right side where in Chasiv Yar everything is supposed to be, where, according to their claim, they have hung these flags because they knew exactly that neutral observers would check the whole thing to keep verifying and essentially keep checking, is it actually in Chasiv Yar, is it actually current, and is it an area where just before the release of this video a few days ago there were absolutely no Russian troops visible. And we can see quite clearly that based on this footage it's evident that various parts and also focal points of the Ukrainian defense, which we had observed in recent weeks where Russian bombs had struck, are now entirely under the control of the Russian forces. And we also had the situation a day later, or rather 2 days later, that our map provider, Deep State Map, also essentially admitted that the center of Chasiv Yar, which was under Ukrainian control until the very end, had by then fallen to the Russians. There are still some contradictions. We'll see it right on the map where the Russians claim they've also taken the western suburbs. And the Ukrainians say that some fighting was still going on there. The flag was raised there, but then we came back. And we see that this is essentially the city center, which also serves as a very industrial hub. It was a crucial transport, particularly railway junction, which is now under Russian control. Yes, and this photo here is, I think, quite symbolic of the Russian concept and vision of liberation. We see the Russian flag peeking out from completely destroyed, unrecognizable ruins, but once again, that is what Russia is aiming for in Ukraine, either the subjugation or the complete destruction of the country to then control the whole as a landscape of ruins. We look at the whole thing on the map, and once again we see that Chasiv Yar was indeed strategically important for the defense of several towns. Namely, on one side we have Kostiantynivka here in the southwest of Chasiv Yar, which is currently being attacked from various directions. On the other hand, now not shown here on the map, but just about 25 kilometers further to the northwest, Kramatorsk is situated. And Kramatorsk too, as a city of 200,000 inhabitants, was at least formally an important target for the Russian army. What I mentioned earlier is that the Russian military campaign to capture Chasiv Yar started more than a year ago, beginning with the occupation of the Canal district on the eastern side of this specific region here. And when we take a closer look, this is pretty much the entire city area of Chasiv Yar, where we clearly observe that the Russian army raised their flag here in the far southwest of the city, firmly marking their presence in one of those large housing complexes. However, we see it here on the map. It's practically not yet acknowledged by our map provider, which still says, according to these Russian flag raisings, there the Ukrainians essentially reclaimed the area. We're not entirely sure yet, or they're not entirely in agreement, if you will. However, according to our information, we have no visual confirmation that this residential area was recaptured there. That means the current information is that all of Chasiv Yar, yes, the entire city area is now under Russian control, and it is of course becoming even more difficult for the defenders in Kostiantynivka, who now not only have to defend themselves to the south and southwest, but also to the northeast. From Chasiv Yar, we move west to the also heavily contested town of Pokrovsk. There, the Russian army managed to capture another suburb, namely Novoukrayinka. And here we see footage that on one hand actually shows us the capture, but on the other hand also includes a very significant propaganda element. Because here we see Russian state television showing us the center of Pokrovsk, meaning the drone starts its recordings here over the center of Pokrovsk, which however is still completely under Ukrainian control. And now it pans to the left and zooms in, or at least that's the impression. Now we see it here pan to the left and zoomed in, and now we see the ruins of Novoukrayinka. We will see on the map in a moment that it was quite a large cut made in between, about 6 kilometers. So this camera movement just now was pure propaganda. You are not nearly as close to the center as you just claimed it to be in that moment. Nonetheless, Novoukrayinka is now under Russian control, and we see the troops posing in the ruins here and now, probably a few kilometers further south, where it was a bit safer for them to position themselves, now trying to reaffirm the whole thing with their flags and making it clear once again, yes, we have captured this further suburb of Pokrovsk. Let's take a look at the map and see that it's really becoming more dangerous for Pokrovsk. What I just mentioned was, on one hand, we saw the center roughly here, and then the shift to the lower left side, and suddenly we found ourselves down in this specific area. That means 6 to 8 kilometers further south. However, and this is even more crucial, the distance from Nova Ukrainka to Pokrovsk itself, we can see here, is only about 2 kilometers. That means it's a relatively short distance the Russians still have to cover in order to reach the former 65,000 inhabitant town. And we can see in Svirovo they've already advanced all the way to Pokrovsk, and now of course the Russians are trying, yes, sticking to their typical tactic, to expand this front, which means significantly limiting Ukraine's ability to respond effectively, particularly in terms of defending against this ongoing and intensified assault on Pokrovsk. And why the Ukrainians are struggling to counterattack is shown in the following video, specifically of a Russian attack on a tank in Pokrovsk. And this tank hid on the northern outskirts, not on the southern outskirts, but relatively far in the north. And we're seeing how incredibly hard it is for Ukraine to even move at all. Because we're now witnessing one after another a fiber-optic-guided kamikaze drone flying into this T-64BV, each time causing progressively more severe and extensive damage to the vehicle. And that is indeed a really big problem for Ukraine. They can no longer rely on their tank technology in the city because the city is now accessible from all sides by these Russian drones. Here we see the next one approaching and then exploding. And because of that, the Ukrainians can no longer achieve anything with their heavy weapons, with their heavy equipment within the city. They couldn't move from point A to point B to stop the Russians, and as we see here, they couldn't even stay quietly within the city. As mentioned, a northern district of the city with very small buildings, they couldn't even hold their ground within the city and quietly wait for the Russians to arrive, who were coming and positioning their drones, because at some point those tanks would also be spotted by the Russian army and accordingly would be destroyed by kamikaze drones. In another area, the Russian army is advancing. We reported on Torsky for the first time yesterday. Torsky, a truly strategic village that essentially represented the front line for the past year and a half, was held by the Ukrainians but has now been largely taken over by the Russian army's forces. First, let's take a look at the map to understand why Torsky is so crucial. It's located between two cities, one under Russian control since 2022 and the other on the other city, which is still currently held by Ukrainian forces at this very moment. The two cities are Kremena here in the east and Lyman here in the west. Both cities, as mentioned, are practically facing each other. We can also see there's only a single road connecting one city to the other. And Torsky was, so to speak, the bulwark the entire time, serving as the main defense line of the Ukrainians to protect Lyman from advancing forces. And now it looks like this village, at least large parts of it, has fallen into the hands of the rapidly advancing enemy forces. We have two new videos of the defense of the village which also show us that the Russians are advancing further and further there. The first video, which we can briefly outline here, was captured directly from the very heart of Torska. There we see how a Ukrainian tank advances right here near Sarishne and essentially bombards the center over a span of about 3 kilometers. And the second thing we look at after that is a Russian advance with an armored vehicle of the MTLB type in the north. From Torske and Sarishne it was intercepted, but we see that the Russians are trying to advance on a broad front here, partly mechanized but mostly on foot. We begin with the footage of the shelling in Torsk itself, and here we're now seeing, as mentioned, a Ukrainian video. This here is a tank that essentially moves forward in Sarishne, now coming to a halt at a corner down here by the edge of this forest. Here we see it. Here the tank is stationed and is now firing ballistically from a distance of about 3 kilometers on a ballistic trajectory toward the center of Torske. And the fact that these tank shells are all hitting the center of Torske already shows us that there are most likely no Ukrainians left there. There is a relatively wide dispersion of these tank shells, possibly even up to several dozen meters over the distance. And so the Ukrainians naturally can't risk shooting their own men there. That means most likely, as we can see from the surveillance drone, the entire center of Torske here is also under Russian control. And we now see that the tank, after completing its task, is withdrawing from there. The second video that we're going to take a look at was the Russian advance north of Torska. And here we can clearly observe that Ukrainian units traditionally deployed these small FPV kamikaze drones, in this case also radio controlled. So here we see DOT, not a coil with fiberglass, but rather the standard RPG-7 grenade strapped underneath. We can observe that the MTLB, the armored vehicle, was completely destroyed by another kamikaze drone launched by the Ukrainian army. And we now see that the drone is going after the Russian soldiers who were obviously in there, of course took some distance after the initial attack and are now desperately attempting to take cover and hide in the bushes surrounding this destroyed and burning MTLB. The whole thing, and I have experienced this myself in one of the command centers for these drones, is that now the information is basically being exchanged. Where did the surveillance drones, where did the Mavic drones and so on see the Russians? Here we see the drone flying around, now steadily gaining altitude to get a better and clearer view of the area. However, there's the armored vehicle, and this here in front, that's the information. That's where the Russian soldiers are suspected to have hidden, who just fled from that vehicle. The drone is now moving in closer and will then go into a kind of circular motion, meaning it's trying to get relatively close to capture everything in detail. We can see the whole thing is shaking a bit. It's radio controlled, and now the drone keeps circling around this bush, maneuvering steadily until it finally spots the hidden Russian soldiers. They have to pixelate the whole thing because they're probably already wounded. And then it flies directly over here to engage the Russian forces who had just attempted to take cover in that specific location and wait for the cover of darkness or something similar before moving forward with their ground advance on foot. We're staying on the topic of kamikaze drones for a moment. We want to highlight that the Russian army is not only using guided drones against military targets, but also firing them quite deliberately at civilian objects and infrastructure. And here we're actually seeing a perspective that's been released by the Russians. Once again, to emphasize, this is a Russian publication by the Russian army showing that a thermal power plant in Kherson in the south of the country was attacked here with fiber-optic-guided kamikaze drones. We see the drones repeatedly approach. The first drone tried to destroy the window. We can clearly see now that by this point, quite a lot has been destroyed, that essentially the windows here were completely shattered and that you can now fly directly into this power plant. And of course, this is solely about attacks on civilians, solely about attacks on civilian infrastructure, because what's being attempted here is to take away heat and electricity from the people by deliberately targeting these power plants and thereby, in a way, preparing for winter, ensuring that the Ukrainians will undoubtedly face extreme cold and the civilians will suffer even more under the relentless Russian attacks. And how widespread these fiber-optic guided drones are and the unbelievable environmental pollution they have also caused. In Ukraine, we see in the following footage, which shows us, first of all, a Mi-24 Hind, an attack helicopter belonging to the Ukrainian army. But the interesting part is where it's flying. Let's see. And hopefully you can also clearly observe these reflections in the quality that are visible all around in the evening sunlight. We're seeing these fiber optic cables everywhere here stretching over the trees. Now we're getting a clear view of that, so to speak, which go up over the trees here and then come back down on the other side. And now we're seeing here on the next field that it's completely covered with fiber optic cables stretching across many kilometers, likely between the front lines of the Russians and Ukrainians. These fiber optic cables have spread out as countless drones flew over them, covering the area extensively. We can see these are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of drones that have flown in this area alone. And we see that, I hope you can spot it by the shimmer all the time here. That's exactly the sort of between the Russian position and the Ukrainian position, and that's where the cables from all the deployed kamikaze drones, which were fiber optic guided, are still lying around to this day and will probably remain there for the foreseeable future, as long as the war continues. And after that, so that these fields can actually be cultivated again without the fiber optics and plastic. Being picked up by the combine harvesters, they of course also had to be cleaned on a large scale. But not only fiberglass drones, but also large kamikaze drones from the Russian army continue to cause problems for the Ukrainians. Here we see attacks on a variety of targets, first on the Russian Smolnija drones. And interestingly, we can observe here that these Smolnija drones have now been rebuilt and extensively modified. So they no longer have a single motor, but instead feature two propeller drives, which we can see here under the wings. And in the middle, this approximately 8 kilogram TM62 anti-tank mine, which is carried by these drones about 50-60 kilometers to then crash into a Ukrainian position or a civilian target. We see the Ukrainians continuing to try to intercept these large kamikaze drones with interceptor drones, with counter drones. And they manage to do it relatively well, at least in these two cases here. We can see that the approach is relatively precise. Next, we see another approach by an interceptor drone, but in this case not at a small one, but at a long-range drone of the Russian army, a so-called Gerberer. There's still an ongoing debate about whether these are armed drones or not. Originally, they were these decoy drones designed to essentially clear the skies or at least create an overload for Ukraine's air defense systems, so that the Shahed 136 or Geran 2 drones wouldn't get intercepted. However, there have been more and more reports recently that these Gerberer drones sometimes carry explosives or even camera equipment with them, which they can then use to gather intel on the targets later attacked by the Shaheds. So it's a significant strike by the Ukrainians, successfully intercepting one of these long-range Shahed drones with a range of about 800 kilometers over the skies of Ukraine. Finally, we want to focus on Ukrainian airstrikes targeting Russian objectives. Here too, various aircraft continue to be used. First, images from Kamyanska. Kamyanska is located in Zaporizhzhia, recently captured by the Russian army. And once again, it's of course the largest building, probably the school in Kamyanska, that was taken over by the Russians to establish themselves there and launch further attacks to the north towards Stepnohursk. However, we now see that precise Ukrainian attacks are taking place here with GBU-62 bombs, specifically Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range. Another attack here in Zaporizhzhia. This means we can see that the Ukrainian Air Force remains active. This here is a group, you can see it a bit on the Telegram channel, that operates with MiG-29s. The first one was supposedly a group that operated with F-16s. So various types of fighter jets were deployed to deliver these extremely precise bombs, which were either sponsored by the USA or France, to their intended targets and to carry out effective and strategic attacks on the Russians at multiple locations south of the front line in the Zaporizhzhia region.